everyone, and welcome to a new video. Today I'll be showing you the process of making this 18th century bodice and skirt. This was made from 6 yards of purple linen with lightweight linen lining. It was inspired by Demelza's wardrobe in the first season of Poldark, which I fell in love with while watching the series. There's a lot I like about this dress, like the color, but also many things that I'm less than thrilled with. Because of that, I debated about posting this video, but sometimes you learn the most from seeing people's mistakes. I also plan on making something similar using a slightly altered version of this pattern in the very near future. I plan on vlogging that project, and I thought this would be a good point of comparison. And in my defense of this piece, it was made in 2 days. I was so excited to get started that I neglected the most important part of the process, which is the pattern and fitting. This accounts for 90% of my issues with this piece, so please keep that in mind. A lot of the techniques I'm using in this video are sound and ones that I will reuse in the future. It was really just the lack of attention towards the pattern and the measuring process prior to cutting things out. And on that note, let's get started! The pattern I'm using for this is very loosely based on one in Janet Arnold's First Patterns of Fashion book. I'm cutting it from the lining first, which is a lightweight linen. If you're wondering about the reference books that I use for patterns and just in general with historical costumes, I actually have a blog post where I review all of them, which I will link down below. The sleeves are cut out from the lining as well. Then all the lining pieces were pinned together. They were also sewed together with 3/4 inch seam allowances. To create boning channels, I turned the seams inward and pinned them down. One thing I do really like about this piece is the weight of the bodice. It's thick enough to support its shape, but very lightweight and comfortable to wear. A lot of this has to do with the lining fabric and the amount of shaping it had, which was mostly thanks to the lining and the boning pattern. That's why when I remake this piece, I'm going to be using the same material for the lining, as well as a similar boning pattern. It's just the actual bodice pattern that's going to change. I sewed across the folded edges of these seams to create the boning channels. Plastic boning was cut to the right lengths, then lightly filed before being inserted into the channels. Now the lining is finished and can be set aside. It's time to repeat those first few steps, this time with the top layer fabric. For this I picked a dark purple linen, which I'm in love with. It is a very fine weave, but just enough texture to look interesting as a finished piece. As I'm pinning my pattern on, you might notice that the arm sky, or arm openings, are very wide and deep, which was one of the major issues with this. I had to make the sleeve cap bigger to fit them, and add volume at the top of the sleeve to provide more mobility. The end result makes my shoulders look wider in an unflattering way that would have been totally unnecessary if not for this mistake. Now everything gets cut out. As I'm doing this, you can see pattern mistake number 2. Look at how wide the back panel is around the waist. This should be much more narrow and slope in a lot more. I had to shape it with darts later on, which ruined how it laid over the skirt. This is why back panels need to be fitted on a dress form over top of the appropriate foundations. It's just too difficult to fit them on yourself since visibility of your back is poor. Now I'm removing the pins from all the pieces and pinning the pieces together, just like you saw with the lining. Then they are sewn together with 3/4 inch seams. I prefer 3/4 inch seams to 1/2 inch seams since they give you a little bit more room for error and to let the garment out if that becomes necessary in the future. After sewing, I ironed these seams open and left them as is. No boning channels for this layer. With the right sides facing each other, I pinned the lining and the top layer of fabric together. I like to line the seams up first, then move from the center back towards the front edge. I'm pinning lining into the sleeves too, except this time I'm focusing on the bottom edge since that's the only one I'll be sewing across. I thought the sleeves looked a little long, so I sewed the lining into the sleeves with a 3/4 inch seam allowance. For the bodice, however, I used 1/2 inch seam allowances. and I stitched across the arm openings, center front edge, the top edge / neckline, and the bottom edge. The only portion I left open were the ends of the straps. Now I'm notching all the curved edges, otherwise they will pucker when you turn them the right way out. I'm also clipping corners and excess bulk from seams. Now the attempts to turn this the right way out began. I sort of forgot this had boning in it. If I remembered that, I would have left the center front edges open too, just to make this process easier. But I didn't do that, which meant this bodice with boning in it was turned the right way out through a single opening in the strap. I am absolutely shocked that this worked. It took a while, but I managed to do it. Then I used a pencil and pliers to get all the corners nice and sharp. Then I pinned around all of the edges. Usually I would secure these edges with large whip stitches on the underside of the fabric, so you don't see the stitching. But since this project was so simple, I decided top stitching would be a nice detail. So I used 2 strands of matching embroidery floss and sewed around all the edges with a running stitch, and I made these stitches pretty long so they would be visible. There are maybe 4 or 5 stitches per inch. I sewed another row of stitching a ½ inch away from the center front edges. This will serve as a boning channel. And I did this before sewing around the top edge. To get the boning in, I had to rip out some stitches securing the lining to the top fabric. Then I cut the boning to the right length and filed the edges. It was inserted into the channel, then I sewed the top of the channel closed, and I carried on stitching around the neckline. This was repeated on the other side too. Overall, I'm really happy with how the top stitching looks. It is a subtle detail, but it makes the dress look homemade, which I really like since it's supposed to be a lower class garment. The sleeves got similar treatment. I turned them the right way out and pinned across the edges. Then I top stitched around the bottom edge, maybe a ½ inch away from the hem. Now back to the bodice. It was time for closures. For this I used size 1 hooks and bars. These are spaced 1.5 inches apart. The bars are sewn onto the other side. I was a little worried about using bars instead of loops, but it ended up working really nicely. The understitching of these isn't great. I'm forever getting frustrated when it comes to sewing these on, and then my stitching ends up really messy. Now I could finally sew up the strap seams. The edges of these were left raw, but I whip stitched the seam allowance down. The bodice was done at this point, aside from the sleeves. The sleeves were lined, but still had to be gathered down to fit the arm sky. I did the gathering by hand with a running stitch pulled taut. Now the sleeves were pinned in place, and these were secured in place with tiny whip stitches. And that was actually it for the bodice. However, at a later fitting, I realized the back was too big, so there are some ugly top stitch darts back there, which I sewed a few minutes before photographing this. And this quick fix unfortunately caused the back point to poke out at a really awkward angle, like a little tail, so it had to be pinned to the skirt to look passable for photos. Definitely not ideal. Now onto the skirt. For this I used all my remaining linen. It was cut with a sloped top, intended to provide volume at the back and a relatively flat front. I wanted this to have a level hem, but it ended up longer in the back and shorter than I'd hoped in the front, since I swapped my foundation garments after cutting it. I transferred the measurements I took onto my material using chalk, then cut it out. Now it was time for the sewing, and the closure method I picked for this is really odd, and it involved sewing the back seam with a 4-inch seam allowance. So here I am, marking a line 4 inches away from the back edge. I blame the weather for this decision. It was summertime, so I was probably warm and on allergy medication and completely delirious. Otherwise, I'm not sure what would have possessed me to make this decision. I sewed this with a straight stitch, stopping 12 inches away from the top. This leaves a wide enough opening to get the skirt on and off. Then I ironed the seam allowance to one side and top stitched it down by hand, about 1 inch away from the seam. The obnoxious seam allowance will serve as a modesty panel and hide any petticoats that try to peek out at the closure point. But adding a modesty panel is easier, it gives a cleaner finish, so I wouldn't recommend this at all. I made this 6 months ago and I'm really unsure of what my thought process was. So at this point I realized the excessive seam allowance was unnecessary, and I cut all of it away except for the top 15 or so inches, which will have some function. The rest of the seams were sewn down as French seams, so I pinned and stitched panels together with the wrong sides facing each other. Then I trimmed the seam allowance down and repinned them with the right sides facing each other. And this was sewn as well. After ironing those, I got to work on the hem. The first step was turning it inward by a 1/2 inch, and I opted to do this by machine. Then I marked a line 4 inches away from the hem using chalk. I folded the hem upward until it touched this line and pinned it down. I sewed this by hand using running stitches. This isn't the prettiest way to finish a hem, but I wanted it to have some texture and be cohesive with the finishings on the bodice. Now it was time to gather down the top edge. I tried a few techniques for this. The first was using running stitches pulled taut until the top edge was the right length, but that didn't look great at all. So the next attempt was making wider stitches to get more of a cartridge pleated effect. But I hadn't prepared the material for cartridge pleats, and I didn't like how it looked either. After a lot of playing around, I chose to knife pleat the top edge, and I actually did a lot of this by eye to get the pleats level on the fabric. I also did parts while it was on the dress form, which is why I don't have any footage of it. Of course, the only method I actually used is the only one I didn't film. Now I cut out a rectangle of leftover linen, which will be used for the waistband. I pinned the waistband to the right side of the fabric. Then sewed it on with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I did sew over pins during this step, but I used a wider stitch length than usual and sewed very, very slowly. I also have an industrial machine, so it's a little bit more durable than a typical home sewing machine, and I'm not too concerned about nicking pins. Now all the pins could be removed. How satisfying is that to watch? I folded the edge of the waistband inward, then folded it inward again. This edge was secured with whip stitches. The final step was sewing in a hook and eye closure. I used one of the wider skirt hooks for this, which isn't historically accurate at all, but I really like. The closure overlaps by a few inches to make it less obvious, and to prevent the petticoats from peeking through. The weird seam allowance modesty panel helps with that too. And that's it! From afar, I don't think this dress looks bad. I really like the hand sewing work on the bodice and the skirt. This also fit me really well across the back, and the waistline was in the right spot, which is an improvement from my first few attempts at this period. However, there are some serious problems, like the length of the skirt and the tail the bodice has in the back. Also, things like the length of the arm sky and the width of the sleeves and straps were pretty detrimental to this. Though these things would be challenging to fix, the good thing about these mistakes is that I can learn from them moving forward. And hopefully you can too. In the end, I wasted a couple yards of fabric in a couple days' time, but I'm determined not to repeat these problems. I'd also like to see if I can salvage the skirt and refashion it with a new bodice. That might make for a fun update video too. In the meantime, I'm putting effort into making another similar dress, but armed with the knowledge I learned from this piece, and a bit more patience when it comes to the fitting process. I'll have a vlog showing that dress coming together up tomorrow, so stay tuned for that. And thank you so much for watching. I shall talk to all of you very soon.